One soldier saved 75 wounded men from the top of a 400-foot cliff while under constant enemy fire, refusing to retreat even when his entire unit was driven back, and he did it without ever carrying a weapon. Private First Class Desmond Doss became the first conscientious objector in American history to receive the Medal of Honor for his actions at Hacksaw Ridge during the Battle of Okinawa. I've analyzed Doss's Medal of Honor citation, combat reports from the 77th Infantry Division, post-war testimonies from the men he saved, and his own accounts from the Library of Congress Veterans History Project. You're about to discover why his own unit tried to have him discharged and beat him in the barracks, how he survived 12 hours alone on a clifftop crawling with Japanese soldiers, and what enemy troops reported when they saw an American medic who seemed impossible to kill. May 5th, 1945. Dawn broke over the Maeda Escarpment on Okinawa with the metallic taste of cordite hanging in the air. Private First Class Desmond Doss knelt in the mud at the base of a 400-foot rock face that soldiers had nicknamed Hacksaw Ridge, his Bible open in his lap, his thin frame silhouetted against the grey morning light. Around him, men from Company B of the 307th Infantry Regiment checked their rifles, fixed bayonets, and adjusted the straps on their helmets. They were preparing to climb back up that cliff into hell itself. Doss was the only man without a weapon. He had no rifle, no pistol, no knife, no grenade, just his medical aid bag, his Bible, and a faith so absolute that it had nearly gotten him court-martialed 6 months earlier. The men around him no longer questioned. One did his courage. They had learned that lesson the hard way. Captain Jack Glover stood nearby, watching Doss pray. 6 months ago, Glover had tried everything in his power to get this skinny kid from Virginia kicked out of the army. He had recommended psychiatric discharge. He had subjected Doss to the worst details he could invent. He had looked the other way when other soldiers beat Doss in the barracks, trying to force him to quit. Glover had been certain that a soldier who refused to touch a weapon was a liability that would get good men killed. Now, on this blood-soaked morning, Glover was waiting for Doss to finish his Sabbath prayers because he would not order his men to attack without their medic. The assault on Hacksaw Ridge had been delayed by direct order of the regimental commander so that Desmond Doss could read his Bible, the transform. The action was complete. The man the army had tried to destroy had become the one soldier they could not fight without. Desmond Thomas Doss was born in Lynchburg, Virginia, on February 7th, 1919, into a family that took the Ten Commandments literally. His mother Bertha was a devout Seventh-day Adventist who raised her sons to believe that Saturday was the Sabbath and that the commandment, "Thou shalt not work on the Sabbath," was the only commandment that mattered. "Shalt not kill" meant exactly what it said. As a boy, Desmond had stared for hours at a framed picture in their home that depicted the Ten Commandments. In particular, he studied the illustration for the Sixth Commandment, showing Cain standing over Abel's body, the first murder. That image burned into his young mind. Years later, he would nearly kill his own brother during a childhood fight, an incident that horrified him and cemented his conviction that taking human life was wrong under any circumstances. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, Desmond was working at the Newport News Naval Shipyard as a ship joiner. His job qualified him for draft deferment. He could have sat out the entire war in safety, building the ships that others would sail into combat. But Desmond Doss was no coward. He believed his country was fighting for freedom, for the protection of the innocent, for the survival of liberty itself. He took the attack personally. Everyone he knew was joining up, and he would not be left behind. On April 1st, 1942, Desmond enlisted in the United States Army. He requested assignment as a combat medic, a non-combatant role that would let him serve his country while honoring his religious convictions. He wanted to save lives, not take them. The army accepted his enlistment, but had no idea what they were getting. Desmond was sent to Fort Jackson, South Carolina, for basic training with the 77th Infantry Division. From the first day, he was marked as different. He refused to train on Saturdays, explaining that it was his Sabbath. He excelled in every physical test, running faster and marching longer than most of his fellow recruits despite his slight build. But when it came time for weapons training, Desmond set down his rifle and walked away. He would not touch it. He would not learn to use it. He would not carry it into combat. His drill instructors were stunned. His fellow soldiers were outraged. In their eyes, Desmond Doss was a coward hiding behind religion, a man who expected others to fight and die for him while he played at being too holy to defend himself. Captain Jack Glover and Sergeant Howell, his immediate superiors, tried everything to break him. They assigned him the worst details, the most grueling labor, the most humiliating tasks. They put him through hell during training, hoping he would quit. When Doss refused to break, they tried to have him discharged on psychiatric grounds under Section 8, arguing that his religious beliefs constituted mental unfitness for service. The request was denied. Doss's convictions were protected by law, and the regulations clearly allowed for conscientious objectors to serve in non-combatant roles. The army could not discharge him simply for refusing to carry a weapon, but they could make his life miserable, and they did. One night, soldiers from his own unit beat Doss in the barracks. They dragged him from his bunk and pummeled him, trying to force him to quit or at least fight back. Doss refused to identify his attackers. When questioned by his superiors, he said only that he had fallen. The beating earned him something he had not expected, a measure of respect. The men realized that Doss could take punishment without breaking, that his convictions were not a pose, but genuine. Still, most considered him a liability. What good was a medic who would not defend himself? What use was a soldier who prayed when he should be fighting? The tension came to a head when the unit was released on leave before deployment. Desmond had planned to marry his girlfriend, Dorothy Schutter, a nurse he had met after taking an injured man to the hospital in Virginia. But the army arrested him for insubordination before he could leave Fort Jackson. His commanding officers had decided to force the issue through a court-martial. Either Doss would be found guilty and removed from the unit, or he would have to compromise his beliefs to avoid military prison. Captain Glover and Dorothy both visited Doss in his cell, trying to convince him to plead guilty to a lesser charge and accept a discharge. Doss refused. He would not compromise. He had done nothing wrong. At his court-martial, Doss pleaded not guilty. The military prosecutors presented their case, arguing that a soldier who refused orders to carry a weapon was unfit for service and dangerous to his comrades. It seemed certain that Doss would be convicted, but what the prosecutors did not know was that Desmond's father, William Doss, was on his way to the courthouse. William was a World War I veteran who had seen the worst of modern warfare in the trenches of France. He had raised his son to be a man of principle, and he would not stand by while the army punished Desmond for having the courage of his convictions. William burst into the courtroom before sentencing, waving a letter from his former commanding officer, now a brigadier general. The letter stated clearly that Desmond's pacifism was protected by the United States Constitution, that men had fought and died to protect exactly this kind of religious freedom, and that the army had no legal basis to court-martial a conscientious objector for refusing to bear arms. The charges were dropped immediately. Desmond was free to marry Dorothy and deploy with his unit. Captain Glover watched the proceedings with a mixture of frustration and grudging admiration. This skinny kid had beaten the entire US Army through sheer stubbornness, but Glover still believed that when they reached combat, Doss's convictions would get men killed. In March 1944, the 77th Infantry Division shipped out to the Pacific Theater. They would see combat first on Guam, then on Leyte in the Philippines. And it was in those battles that Desmond Doss began to prove himself. On Guam, he treated wounded men under fire, crawling through machine gun fire to reach soldiers who had been hit. He dressed wounds while bullets snapped past his head. He dragged men to safety while mortar shells exploded around him. He never hesitated, never sought cover for himself until every wounded man had been evacuated. For his actions on Guam, Doss was awarded the Bronze Star for valor. On Leyte, he did it again, running into enemy fire to save wounded soldiers while the rest of the company took cover. He earned a second Bronze Star. By the time the 77th Division was ordered to Okinawa, the men of Company B no longer questioned whether their medic was brave. They knew he would come for them. They knew he would risk his life for theirs. Captain Glover had stopped trying to get Doss transferred. The man was essential, but none of them, not even Doss himself, could have imagined what was waiting for them on Okinawa. The island was the last major obstacle before an invasion of Japan itself. The Japanese had spent years fortifying it, turning every hill into a fortress, every cave into a bunker, every ridge into a killing ground. They would defend Okinawa with fanatical determination, knowing that losing it meant the war would come home to their families. The 77th Division was ordered to relieve the 96th Infantry Division, which had been fighting for weeks to take a particular piece of terrain. It was a 400-foot cliff of jagged rock, honeycombed with caves and tunnels where Japanese soldiers had dug in with machine guns, mortars, and artillery. The Americans had to climb cargo nets to reach the top, exposing themselves to fire every foot of the way. Once on top, they found a plateau that offered no cover, no safety, just open ground swept by overlapping fields of fire. The men who fought there gave it a simple name, Hacksaw Ridge. And on that ridge, Desmond Doss would do something that would seem impossible, even to those who witnessed it. As Captain Glover gave the order to move out on the morning of May 5th, Doss closed his Bible and tucked it into his jacket. He picked up his medical aid bag and moved toward the cargo nets that dangled down the face of Hacksaw Ridge. Around him, soldiers shouldered their rifles and prepared to climb back into the hell they had barely escaped the day before. But what they did not know was that within hours, everything would go catastrophically wrong, that a Japanese counterattack would drive them back down that cliff in a panicked retreat, and that their medic would refuse to leave. What they did not know was that Desmond Doss was about to begin the longest night of his life, 12 hours alone on a clifftop, with 75 wounded men and an entire Japanese battalion hunting him. And what the Japanese did not know was that they were about to encounter an American soldier who could not be killed, who would drag man after man to safety, while bullets and mortars searched for him in the smoke, who would lower body after body down a 400-foot cliff, using a rope and a knot he had never seen before in his life. The battle for Hacksaw Ridge was about to become a legend, and the man at its center carried no weapon at all. The 77th Infantry Division arrived on Okinawa in late April 1945, sailing into a nightmare that had already consumed the 96th Infantry Division. For 3 weeks, men from the 96th had thrown themselves at a 400-foot rock face the Japanese had transformed into a fortress. The Americans called it Hacksaw Ridge. The Japanese called it the Maeda Escarpment. Both sides knew it as a killing ground where entire companies were reduced to handfuls of survivors in a single afternoon. The 96th Division had begun its assault on April 26th with full-strength companies. By April 29th, when the 77th Division moved into position to relieve them, some platoons had been reduced to 5 or 6 men. The 381st Infantry Regiment had suffered over 1,000 casualties in just 4 days of fighting on that ridge. Men came down from the escarpment sobbing, saying they could not go back, that nothing could survive up there. And then they went back anyway, because someone had to take that ridge. The tactical problem was simple to describe and impossible to solve. Hacksaw Ridge was a plateau stretching over 4,000 yards from east to west, sitting atop a sheer rock wall that rose 400 feet from the surrounding farmland. At its eastern end stood Needle Rock, a finger of stone barely 2 feet wide at the top. From there, The crest gradually widened until it reached perhaps 200 feet across at the western end. To reach the top, soldiers had to climb cargo nets or rope ladders while exposed to fire from above. Once on the plateau, they found no cover, just open ground commanded by Japanese machine guns, firing from caves in the reverse slope. The Japanese had spent months preparing their defenses. They had carved an intricate network of tunnels and caves into the southern face of the escarpment, connecting pillboxes on top to bunkers below. They could move through these passages unseen, shifting forces to counter any American attack, bringing up ammunition and reinforcements while remaining invisible to American observers. When artillery or naval gunfire pounded the ridge, the Japanese simply retreated into their caves and waited. When the barrage lifted and American infantry began their climb, the Japanese emerged and slaughtered them. But what made Hacksaw Ridge particularly deadly was the reverse slope defense, a tactic at which the Japanese had become brutally efficient. American forces approaching from the north could not see the defenders or their weapons until they reached the crest of the escarpment. There was no way to suppress the enemy positions with preparatory fire because the positions could not be observed. The first indication that Japanese soldiers were waiting came when machine guns opened fire at point-blank range, cutting down the lead elements before they could react. Men who made it to the top found themselves on a narrow strip of rock with nowhere to go and no way back down except to jump or be thrown from the cliff by Japanese counterattacks. The 96th Division had tried everything. They had sent tanks, but the terrain was impassable for armor. They had called in massive artillery bombardments, but the shells could not reach the reverse slope positions. They had used flamethrowers and explosives to clear caves, but there were too many caves and too few flamethrowers. After 4 days of continuous assault, the 96th Division had gained a tenuous foothold on parts of the escarpment, but could not hold it. Japanese counterattacks drove them back repeatedly. The division was bled white, its combat effectiveness destroyed. The 307th Infantry Regiment of the 77th Division moved into position on April 29th. Company B, Desmond Doss's unit, was assigned to the western portion of the escarpment. They would climb cargo nets that dangled down the cliff face, reach the top, and attempt to secure the plateau so that engineers could carve trails wide enough for supplies and reinforcements to follow. Captain Glover knew the odds. He had seen the casualty reports from the 96th Division. He knew that his company was about to be fed into a meat grinder, but he also knew that Hacksaw Ridge had to be taken. As long as the Japanese held that escarpment, they controlled the high ground dominating Highway 5, the main American supply route. The entire offensive would stall until that ridge fell. On the morning of April 30th, Company B began its assault. The climb itself was an ordeal. The cargo nets swayed and twisted as men climbed, making every foot gained a struggle. Japanese soldiers on the rim of the escarpment waited until the nets were full of climbing Americans before opening fire. Bullets snapped through the ropes. Grenades tumbled down from above, exploding among the climbers. Men fell, some dropping the full 400 feet to the rocks below, others catching themselves on the nets with one hand while trying to return fire with the other. Doss climbed with his medical aid bag slung across his back, no weapon in his hands, watching men above him get hit and fall. He kept climbing. By the time Company B reached the top, they had already taken casualties, but they had made it further than some previous attempts. They dug in along the edge of the escarpment, trying to expand their foothold while Japanese fire swept across the exposed plateau. For the next 4 days, Company B fought to hold its position and pushed deeper onto the escarpment. Doss was everywhere, crawling through machine gun fire to reach wounded men, dragging them back to the cliff edge where they could be lowered to safety below. On May 2nd, he crawled 200 yards forward of the American lines to reach a wounded soldier lying in the open. Japanese mortars and rifle fire churned the ground around him as he dressed the man's wounds and dragged him back. 2 days later, he treated 4 men who had been cut down while assaulting a cave. The cave mouth was only 8 yards away, close enough that Doss could see the Japanese soldiers inside. Grenades flew back and forth while Doss worked, applying bandages and tourniquets, stabilizing each man before making 4 separate trips under fire to evacuate them to safety. He earned a Bronze Star for his actions on Guam and another for Leyte. Now, on Hacksaw Ridge, he was proving that those medals had not been flukes. The man was fearless. But what Company B and the rest of the 77th Division did not fully understand yet was the nature of the enemy they faced. The Japanese 32nd Army defending Okinawa had been given a single mission: delay the American advance for as long as possible. Every day the Americans were tied down on Okinawa was another day Japan had to prepare for the inevitable invasion of the home islands. The Japanese soldiers on Hacksaw Ridge were not fighting to win. They were fighting to die as slowly and expensively as possible. They had no hope of reinforcement or relief. They had been ordered to hold until annihilated, and they would obey that order to the last man. The commander of the Japanese 32nd Army, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, had spent months fortifying southern Okinawa. His chief of staff, Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, had designed a defense in depth that exploited every ridge, every cave, every piece of terrain that could be turned into a strong point. Yahara understood that Japan could not defeat the Americans in open battle. American firepower was too overwhelming, American logistics too efficient. But Yahara also understood that Americans counted their casualties, that they measured success in lives saved as much as objectives taken. If the Japanese could make every yard of Okinawa cost enough American blood, perhaps the invasion of Japan itself would be deemed too expensive. Perhaps negotiations would become possible. The Maeda Escarpment was a key piece of that strategy. As long as the Japanese held it, the American advance stalled. And while the Americans bled themselves white trying to take it, Japanese suicide planes were savaging the American fleet offshore. By early May, kamikaze attacks had sunk or damaged dozens of ships, killed thousands of sailors. Admiral Nimitz was complaining that the Navy was losing a ship and a half every day supporting the ground campaign. The longer Hacksaw Ridge held, the more ships the Japanese could sink, the higher the total butcher's bill climbed. Every American soldier who fell on that ridge, every sailor who died when a kamikaze crashed into his ship was part of Japan's strategy. They were buying time with American lives. But something was happening on Hacksaw Ridge that neither side had anticipated. By May 4th, the Americans had secured most of the escarpment's crest. The Japanese still held the reverse slope and the network of caves, but the top belonged to Company B and the other American units that had climbed those nets day after day, dying by the dozens to gain each yard of plateau. The men were exhausted, filthy, traumatized. They had seen things that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They had watched friends die in ways too horrible to describe. Some had been on that ridge for 5 days straight without sleep, without hot food, without any relief except the few minutes it took to drag another body to the cliff edge. And through it all, Desmond Doss had moved among them, unarmed and impossible to kill, saving lives when everyone else was taking them. The men of Company B had stopped questioning whether Doss would come for them. They knew he would. They had seen him crawl into fire that sent everyone else diving for cover. They had watched him treat men who were certainly going to die, speaking gently to them, comforting them, making their last moments less terrifying. Some of the soldiers Doss treated were men who had beaten him in the barracks 6 months earlier, who had called him a coward, who had tried to drive him out of the army. Doss saved them anyway. He never mentioned the beatings. He never kept score. He just did his job over and over while bullets searched for him and never quite found their mark. On the night of May 4th, Captain Glover received orders for the next day's assault. Company B would push south across the escarpment, clearing the remaining Japanese positions on the plateau before driving down into the reverse slope to destroy the cave network. It would be the hardest fighting yet. The Japanese would counterattack with everything they had left. Casualties would be heavy, but if the attack succeeded, Hacksaw Ridge would finally fall. Glover gathered his officers and sergeants to brief them on the plan. Doss sat in on the briefing, listening quietly. Someone asked about medical support. Glover looked at Doss and said simply that their medic would be with them. No one questioned it. No one suggested that Doss might want to stay back in a safer position. They needed him forward, and they knew he would be there. What none of them knew, what none of them could have imagined, was that within 12 hours, everything would go catastrophically wrong. The Japanese were about to launch a massive counterattack, the largest they had attempted since the Americans landed on Okinawa. And when that attack came screaming out of the caves and tunnels of Hacksaw Ridge, Company B would be driven back in a panicked retreat, leaving their wounded behind on the plateau. Every man would scramble down those cargo nets as fast as he could, desperate to escape the wave of Japanese soldiers sweeping across the escarpment. Every man except one. Desmond Doss would stay behind, and over the next 12 hours, alone on a clifftop with 75 wounded men and an entire Japanese battalion hunting him, he would accomplish something that would seem impossible even to those who witnessed it. May 5th, 1945, dawned as Desmond Doss's Sabbath. It was Saturday, the day he devoted to prayer and rest according to his Seventh-day Adventist faith. Under normal circumstances, Doss would not work, would not perform any labor beyond what was absolutely necessary. But on Hacksaw Ridge, there were no normal circumstances. Company B was down to one medic, and Captain Glover had made it clear that the assault scheduled for that morning would not proceed without him. Doss agreed to go, but he requested time to read his Bible first. The request went up the chain of command. Regimental headquarters delayed the assault. Across the escarpment, hundreds of soldiers waited while Desmond Doss knelt in the mud and prayed. When he finished, he picked up his medical aid bag and moved toward the cargo nets, for what he thought would be another day of treating wounded men and dragging them to safety. He had no way of knowing that this Saturday would be different from all the others, that within hours his faith would be tested in ways he could never have imagined. The assault began in the pre-dawn darkness. Company B climbed the cargo nets and spread out across the plateau, moving south to clear the remaining Japanese positions. The fighting was vicious from the first moments. Japanese soldiers emerged from caves and tunnels, attacking with grenades, bayonets, and close-range gunfire. American soldiers fired back, called for artillery support, threw grenades into cave mouths, and inched forward across the blood-soaked plateau. Doss moved with them, treating men as they fell, dragging them back toward the cliff edge where they could be lowered to safety. The noise was overwhelming, a constant roar of explosions, gunfire, and screaming that made communication nearly impossible. Smoke from burning vegetation and phosphorus shells drifted across the escarpment, reducing visibility to yards. Men fought enemies they could barely see, firing at muzzle flashes and shadows in the haze. But what the Americans on Hacksaw Ridge did not know was that the Japanese were preparing something unprecedented. General Isamu Cho, Chief of Staff of the 32nd Army, had spent days planning a massive counterattack designed to recapture the Maeda Escarpment and drive the Americans back. He had concentrated extra infantry, 2 companies of tanks, heavy artillery, and even rare air support for this assault. The Japanese understood that Hacksaw Ridge was the key to the entire American offensive. If they could retake it, the American advance would stall indefinitely. The counterattack had originally been scheduled for May 4th, but had been delayed by logistics problems. Now it was coming on May 5th, and the Americans advancing across the plateau were about to walk directly into it. By mid-morning, Company B had pushed deep into Japanese-held territory on the southern portion of the escarpment. They were clearing caves, securing strongpoints, making real progress. And then the world exploded. The Japanese counterattack hit Company B like a tsunami. Hundreds of soldiers poured out of caves and tunnels that the Americans thought had been cleared or sealed. They came screaming, firing, throwing grenades, wielding bayonets and swords. Behind them, Japanese artillery opened up with a concentration of fire unlike anything the Americans had experienced on Okinawa. Mortar shells rained down. High explosive rounds walked across the plateau, and machine guns swept the open ground from multiple directions. Company B was caught in the open with no cover and no room to maneuver. Men fell in clusters, cut down by the overlapping fields of fire. Others were blown apart by artillery. The survivors tried to fight back, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Within minutes, the American position collapsed. Captain Glover gave the order to retreat. It was either pull back or be annihilated where they stood. The retreat down the cargo nets was chaos. Men scrambled for the cliff edge, throwing themselves at the nets and sliding down as fast as they could. Some fell, their grip failing, or the nets cut by Japanese fire. Others made it to the bottom with nothing but the clothes on their backs, having dropped weapons, helmets, even boots in their desperate flight. The Japanese pressed the attack, pursuing the retreating Americans to the very edge of the escarpment, firing down at them as they descended. Artillery continued to pound the cliff face, trying to blow the nets loose and send climbers plunging to the rocks below. By the time the survivors reached the bottom, Company B had ceased to exist as an effective fighting unit. Officers did hasty headcounts and realized with horror how many men we unaccounted for. Dozens of soldiers were still on top of that ridge, wounded and unable to retreat on their own. They would be dead within minutes when the Japanese swept across the plateau to secure their victory. But one American soldier had not retreated. Desmond Doss had heard Captain Glover's order, had watched his comrades flee toward the cliff edge, had felt the ground shake under Japanese artillery, and he had stayed. All around him, wounded men were screaming for help. Some had been hit during the initial counterattack and left behind when their squads pulled back. Others had been wounded earlier in the day and were waiting for evacuation when the retreat began. Doss could hear them calling out, begging not to be left behind, crying for their mothers, for medics, for anyone who would help them. He could not leave them. His faith would not permit it. So while the last able-bodied soldiers scrambled down the cargo nets to safety, Doss moved in the opposite direction, crawling deeper into the smoke and fire toward the voices of the wounded. The first man Doss reached had been hit in the legs by shrapnel. He could not walk, could barely move. Japanese soldiers were somewhere in the smoke nearby, searching for survivors to bayonet or capture. Doss dressed the man's wounds quickly, speaking quietly to him, telling him he was going to be okay, even though neither of them believed it. Then Doss grabbed the man by his equipment straps and began dragging him toward the cliff edge. It was perhaps 50 yards, but it felt like miles. Every foot of ground was exposed to Japanese fire. Mortar shells continued to fall randomly across the plateau. Doss could hear Japanese voices shouting to each other in the smoke, coordinating their sweep of the escarpment. He dragged the wounded soldier behind rocks, through shell holes, across ground churned into mud by explosions and blood. When they reached the cliff edge, Doss faced a problem he had never encountered before. There were no medics at the bottom of the nets, waiting to receive casualties. Company B had retreated in such chaos that medical support had collapsed. Doss was alone on top of a 400-foot cliff with a wounded man who needed immediate evacuation and no way to get him down. In that moment, Doss prayed. He had been praying constantly since the counterattack began, but now he prayed specifically for guidance. How could he lower a wounded man down a sheer cliff with no help? And then, as he would later describe it, a thought came into his mind. A knot. He had never seen this knot before, had never been taught it, but suddenly he understood exactly how to tie it. He doubled the rope that had been used for lowering supplies, created what he called a double bowline knot, and fashioned a sling that would support a man's weight. He loaded the wounded soldier into the sling, wrapped the rope around a secure point on the cliff edge, and began lowering him down hand over hand. It took several minutes. The rope burned through his palms. His shoulders screamed with the effort. But the soldier reached the bottom alive, and medics below pulled him from the sling. Doss pulled the rope back up and prayed, "Lord, please help me get one more." He went back into the smoke. The Japanese were sweeping the plateau systematically now, clearing every shell hole, every cave mouth, every piece of cover where a wounded American might be hiding. Doss could hear gunshots as they executed the wounded they found. He crawled toward the next voice he heard calling for help. Found another soldier. This one shot through the chest and struggling to breathe. Doss treated him as best he could, knowing the man would die without immediate surgery, but doing what he could to buy him time. Then he dragged him to the cliff edge and lowered him down. The process took 10 minutes from start to finish. One more man saved. Doss prayed again, "Lord, please help me get one more." And he went back into the smoke. This pattern continued as the sun climbed higher and the day grew hot. Doss would crawl forward, locate a wounded man by following his voice, stabilize his injuries, drag him to the cliff edge, lower him down the rope sling, and return for another. Sometimes the wounded men were conscious and could help by clinging to Doss's shoulders or equipment. Other times they were unconscious or in shock, dead weight that Doss had to haul across the plateau by sheer force. He moved methodically, conserving his strength, choosing the wounded who were closest or whose injuries seemed most urgent. He avoided areas where Japanese voices were loudest. Several times he hid in shell holes or behind rocks as enemy soldiers passed within yards of his position. They were looking for armed Americans, and Doss, with his medical bag and no weapon, did not register as a threat until it was too late for them to react. The men at the bottom of the cliff could not believe what they were seeing. Body after body appeared at the cliff edge, lowered down in a rope sling that seemed to materialize out of the smoke and fire above. At first, they thought multiple medics had stayed behind, that there must be an organized evacuation effort happening on the plateau. Then they realized the rope was always the same, coming from the same point on the cliff edge, and the same hand was visible above, controlling the descent. Someone asked who was up there lowering wounded. A soldier, who had retreated earlier, said it had to be Doss. Nobody else would have stayed behind. But it seemed impossible that one man, alone and unarmed, could survive up there for more than a few minutes, let alone hours. Captain Glover watched the bodies descending and felt something break inside him. 6 months ago, he had tried to destroy this man, had done everything in his power to drive Doss out of the army. He had been certain that Doss's convictions would get good men killed. Now, Doss was alone on a clifftop, saving those same men, while Glover stood at the bottom, safe and useless. Some of the wounded coming down the cliff were men who had beaten Doss in the barracks, who had mocked his faith, who had called him a coward. Doss was saving them anyway. He was not keeping score. He was just doing his job over and over, in conditions that should have killed him 10 times over. Glover began organizing the evacuation effort at the bottom of the cliff, making sure that medics were ready to receive each wounded man as he came down, that ambulances were standing by to transport them to aid stations. It was all he could do. The man doing the real work was 400 feet above him, crawling through hell with nothing but faith in a medical bag. As the hours passed, the Japanese began to realize something strange was happening. Their soldiers sweeping the plateau kept reporting that they were finding fewer wounded Americans than expected. The wounded were disappearing. Some Japanese soldiers claimed to have seen an American medic crawling across the plateau, dragging men toward the cliff edge, but he seemed impossible to hit. They would fire at him and miss, or lose sight of him in the smoke. One Japanese officer later wrote in his combat diary that there were reports of an American soldier who could not be killed, who moved through their fire as if protected by some invisible shield. The Japanese began to fear him. Some refused to pursue wounded Americans toward the cliff edge, believing that the area was cursed or that the unarmed medic was some kind of ghost. By early afternoon, Doss had been on the plateau for over 6 hours. He had saved perhaps 50 men, though he had lost count. He was exhausted, dehydrated, running low on medical supplies. His hands were torn and bleeding from the rope. His uniform was soaked with other men's blood. But he kept going back. Every time he lowered a man down and pulled the rope back up, he prayed the same prayer. Lord, please help me get one more. And every time there was one more. A soldier with a shattered leg. A sergeant with his intestines held in by a field dressing. A private who had been shot through both arms and could not stop screaming. Doss found them, treated them, dragged them to the cliff, lowered them down. One more, and another, and another. At some point during those hours, Doss encountered Japanese wounded. They were lying among the American casualties, left behind when the Japanese counterattack pushed forward. Some were dying, others were conscious, terrified, certain that the Americans would kill them in revenge. Doss treated them. He could not speak Japanese, but he used gestures to show them he meant no harm. He dressed their wounds with the same care he gave to Americans. He gave them water from his canteen. He could not lower them down the cliff, because doing so would likely get them killed by American soldiers at the bottom. But he made them as comfortable as he could and moved on to the next wounded man. His faith demanded that he help anyone who needed it, enemy or not. The commandment said, "Thou shalt not kill." He did not say, "Thou shalt kill if they are Japanese." As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, Doss realized he was running out of time. The Japanese would launch night attacks, and once darkness fell, he would be unable to see the wounded or navigate across the plateau. He had to find every man he could before then. He pushed himself beyond exhaustion, crawling faster, dragging wounded men by pure stubbornness when his muscles screamed for rest. 70 men saved. 75. He had stopped counting, stopped thinking about anything except the next voice calling for help, the next soldier who needed him. His prayer had become automatic. Lord, please help me get one more. He no longer knew if God was listening or if he was simply talking to himself to stay conscious. When full darkness came, Doss finally stopped. He had saved 75 men, though he would not know the count until later. He had crawled across Hacksaw Ridge for 12 hours under constant enemy fire, dragging wounded men to safety one at a time, lowering them down a 400-foot cliff using a knot he had never seen before. He had moved through Japanese positions that should have killed him 100 times over, and he had survived. As he made his way to the cliff edge for the last time, preparing to descend himself, he realized that he could no longer hear any American voices calling for help. Either he had found them all, or the ones he had not found were already dead. He had done everything he could. He lowered himself down the cargo net, moving slowly because his hands would barely close around the rope. When his feet touched the ground at the bottom, soldiers surrounded him. They stared at him as if he were a ghost. His uniform was torn and blood-soaked. His face was black with powder residue and grime. He was swaying on his feet, barely conscious. But he was alive, and 75 men were alive because of him. Captain Glover pushed through the crowd and stood in front of Doss. For a long moment he could not speak. Finally he said, "You're one of the bravest persons alive." It was not an exaggeration. Glover had seen men earn medals for single acts of courage that lasted minutes. Doss had sustained that courage for 12 hours. Alone, unarmed, refusing to leave until every man who could be saved had been saved. The soldiers around them were silent, processing what they had witnessed. Many of them had called Doss a coward 6 months ago. They would never use that word again. One soldier, a man who had beaten Doss in the barracks during basic training, stepped forward and said, "I swear to God, Doss, I thought you were crazy, but you saved my life up there. Thank you." Others echoed him, men whose lives Doss had saved, forming a line to shake his hand or embrace him. Doss accepted their gratitude quietly, too exhausted to speak. All he wanted was water, food, and sleep. But what he did not know yet was that his war was not over, that in 2 weeks he would be wounded so severely that he would spend years recovering, and that before it was all finished, he would stand in the White House while the President of the United States placed the Medal of Honor around his neck. The morning after Hacksaw Ridge, the men of Company B prepared to return to the escarpment. But they would not go without their medic. Captain Glover met with Doss and said something that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. The unit was scheduled to retake the ridge on Saturday, Doss's Sabbath, but Glover would not order the assault without him. Would Doss be willing to join them after his prayers? Doss agreed. On the morning of May 6th, the assault waited while Desmond Doss knelt with his Bible. When he finished praying, Company B climbed back up those cargo nets and fought their way across the plateau. This time, with reinforcements from other units and the psychological impact of Doss's impossible survival still fresh in Japanese minds, the ridge fell. The 77th Infantry Division, Ion, secured the Maeda Escarpment. The key to the entire American offensive on Okinawa was finally in American hands, but the cost had been staggering. The 1st Battalion of the 307th Infantry had gone up on the escarpment on April 29th with approximately 800 men. When they came down on May 7th, only 324 remained. The transformation within Company B was complete. The men who had once tried to drive Doss out of the army now refused to advance without him. Soldiers who had beaten him in the barracks now told anyone who would listen that he was the bravest man they had ever seen. Captain Glover, who had recommended Doss for psychiatric discharge, began preparing the paperwork for a Medal of Honor recommendation. The evidence was overwhelming. Doss had not simply saved lives under fire, which dozens of medics had done throughout the war. He had stayed behind when everyone else retreated, alone on a clifftop with enemy soldiers hunting him, and had systematically rescued 75 men over 12 hours, using nothing but faith, a rope, and a knot he claimed God had taught him. It was beyond comprehension. Multiple officers from Company B submitted sworn statements describing what they had witnessed. One lieutenant wrote that Doss had lowered wounded men from the cliff edge while Japanese soldiers were visible in the smoke less than 50 yards away, that he had worked methodically without apparent fear, that he had refused to leave until every wounded man had been evacuated. A sergeant described watching from below as body after body appeared at the cliff edge, how they had assumed multiple medics were working above until they realized it was always the same rope. Always the same hands controlling the descent. Private after private testified that Doss had saved their lives, that he had crawled to them when they were certain they would die, that he had treated their wounds and dragged them to safety while bullets searched for him. But why had the Japanese not killed him? This question haunted American officers who tried to understand what had happened on May 5th. Doss had spent 12 hours crawling across an open plateau, where dozens of American soldiers had been cut down in minutes during the initial assault. He had been unarmed, moving slowly while dragging wounded men, presenting an obvious target. Japanese soldiers had been sweeping the escarpment methodically, executing wounded Americans they found. Yet Doss had survived without a scratch. Some of the men in Company B believed it was a miracle, that God had literally shielded Doss from enemy fire. Others suggested that the smoke and confusion of battle had provided cover, that Doss had been lucky. But intelligence reports from Japanese prisoners offered a different explanation. Several Japanese soldiers reported that their comrades had fired at an American medic on the escarpment, but that he seemed impossible to hit. They described him as moving like a ghost, appearing and disappearing in the smoke, always somewhere unexpected. Some Japanese soldiers claimed they had aimed directly at him and watched their bullets miss. One prisoner said that after multiple soldiers had failed to kill the medic, some Japanese troops began to believe he was protected by supernatural forces and refused to shoot at him out of superstitious fear. Whether divine intervention or simple luck, Doss had survived what should have killed him many times over. In the days following the capture of Hacksaw Ridge, Doss continued his work as a medic. Company B pushed south, clearing Japanese positions, taking casualties, and Doss treated them all. He had become a legend within the 77th Division. Soldiers from other companies who had never met him knew his name, knew what he had done. Officers from other units visited to see the conscientious objector who had saved 75 men. Some asked him how he had done it. Doss's answer was always the same. He had prayed, and God had given him the strength to get one more man, and then another and another, until there were no more left to save. He gave no credit to himself. It had been God's work. He had simply been the instrument. But Doss's war was not over. On the night of May 21st, 16 days after his ordeal on Hacksaw Ridge, Company B was advancing in darkness near Shuri when they inadvertently walked into a Japanese position. The enemy attacked with grenades and small arms fire. Men scattered, seeking cover, returning fire, calling for medics. Doss moved forward to treat the wounded, as he always did. He found himself in a shell hole with 2 riflemen, all 3 of them pinned down by Japanese fire. And then Doss heard the metallic clink of a grenade landing in the shell hole with them. He saw it in the darkness, a dark shape rolling toward them. There was no time to throw it back. Doss did the only thing he could think of. He kicked it away from the 2 riflemen with his left foot, threw himself flat and sayed his helmet into the dirt. The grenade exploded half a second later. The blast threw Desmond Doss into the air. He felt himself flying, saw stars that were not in the sky, felt impact as he hit the ground. When his vision cleared, he was lying on his back, staring up at the darkness. His legs felt wrong. He reached down and felt wetness, warmth, the unmistakable sensation of blood flowing from multiple wounds. Shrapnel from the grenade had torn into his legs and up to his hip. 17 pieces of metal were embedded in his flesh. The pain was extraordinary. He could hear the rifleman who had been in the shell hole with him calling his name, asking if he was alive. Doss told them he was hit but conscious. They wanted to call another medic. Doss refused. He would not risk another medic's life by having him come forward into this fire. Instead, Doss treated himself. He pulled bandages and sulfur powder from his medical bag and dressed his own wounds as best he could, working by touch in the darkness, trying to stop the bleeding. It took perhaps 10 minutes. The rifleman helped him apply tourniquets to his legs. When he was as stable as he could make himself, Doss told them to get word back that he needed evacuation, but that there was no rush. He would wait. He waited 5 hours. Litter bearers could not reach his position until the Japanese fire slackened with the coming dawn. When they finally arrived, they loaded Doss onto a stretcher and began carrying him back to the aid station. The trip required navigating through broken terrain under sporadic enemy fire. The litter bearers moved carefully, trying not to jostle Doss's injuries. They were perhaps halfway to safety when Japanese soldiers launched another attack. A Type 95 tank appeared, firing its main gun at American positions. Enemy infantry followed the tank, pressing the assault. The litter bearers carrying Doss had to drop him and take cover or be killed. The stretcher hit the ground hard. Doss lay there, unable to move, watching the firefight develop around him. And then he saw a knot, her wounded soldier lying nearby, hit worse than he was, bleeding heavily from a chest wound. The man was going to die if he did not get immediate medical attention. Desmond Doss rolled off his stretcher. He crawled through the dirt to the wounded soldier, dragging his injured legs behind him, leaving a trail of blood. He reached the man and began treating his wounds, stabilizing him as best he could. When the litter bearers returned after the attack was repulsed, Doss told them to take the other soldier first. They argued. Doss was their casualty. He needed evacuation. He was losing blood. Doss refused to move. The other man was worse off. Take him. So they did. They loaded the more critically wounded soldier onto the stretcher and carried him to the aid station. Doss waited again, alone and bleeding, for them to return. It was during this wait, while he lay in the dirt unable to move, that a Japanese sniper found him. The bullet hit Doss's left arm, US above the wrist, travelled through his elbow joint and lodged in his upper arm. Bones shattered. The arm went useless, hanging at an unnatural angle. The pain was blinding. Doss was now wounded in both legs and one arm, lying in the open, unable to walk or defend himself. He borrowed a rifle from a nearby soldier. Not to fire it. Doss would never fire a weapon, but he could use the wooden stock as a splint. Working with his one good hand and his teeth, Doss bound the rifle stock to his shattered arm, immobilizing the joint. Then he began crawling toward the aid station. He had to cover 300 yards of rough terrain with both legs injured and one arm useless. He moved a few feet at a time, resting, then moving again. The journey took over an hour. Soldiers who saw him crawling stopped what they were doing to stare. This man had survived Hacksaw Ridge, had saved 75 lives, and now he was crawling through the dirt with catastrophic injuries, still refusing to call for help because he did not want to endanger another medic. When Doss finally reached the aid station, medics rushed to him and began emergency treatment. He had lost a dangerous amount of blood. His injuries were severe enough that he would be evacuated from Okinawa and sent back to the United States for long-term treatment. On the hospital ship USS Mercy, as Doss was being prepared for the voyage home, he realized with horror that his Bible was missing. It was the Bible Dorothy had given him before he deployed, the small volume he had carried through Guam, Leyte, and Okinawa. It had been his constant companion, his source of strength. He had clutched it during the descent from Hacksaw Ridge after his 12-hour ordeal. But somewhere between being wounded and reaching the hospital ship, it had been lost. Doss was devastated. In a letter to Dorothy, he wrote that he felt lost without it, that the Bible had been his main source of strength throughout the war. When the men of Company B learned that Doss's Bible was missing, they organized a search party. Multiple soldiers volunteered to return to the battlefield, where Doss had been wounded, an area that was still under sporadic enemy fire, to search for a small book. They scoured the ground for hours, checking shell holes and ditches, until finally one soldier found it. The Bible had fallen into a crater and been partially buried by dirt. They cleaned it off, dried the pages, and arranged for it to be sent to the hospital ship. When Doss received his Bible back, he wept. These men, some of whom had beaten him and tried to drive him from the army, had risked their lives to recover his Bible because they knew what it meant to him. Desmond Doss's war was over. He would spend months in military hospitals having shrapnel removed and bones set. The sniper's bullet had done such extensive damage to his arm that he would never regain full use of it. Later, he would develop tuberculosis contracted during his time in the Pacific, and doctors would remove his left lung and 5 ribs. He would live the rest of his life with these injuries, a permanent reminder of what he had sacrificed. But before the medical discharges and the long recovery, there would be one more ceremony. On October 12, 1945, at the White House, Desmond Doss stood before President Harry S. Truman while his Medal of Honor citation was read aloud. Truman shook Doss's hand firmly and held it while he looked at the young medic. The president said, "I'm proud of you. You really deserve this. I consider this a greater honor than being president." Desmond Doss became the first conscientious objector in American history to receive the Medal of Honor. Of the 16 million men who served in World War II, only 431 received that medal. Doss had earned it without ever touching a weapon, without ever compromising his faith, by doing exactly what he had always said he would do, saving lives instead of taking them. Desmond Doss returned to Lynchburg, Virginia, a hero, but he never saw himself that way. He spent the next 6 years in and out of hospitals, battling tuberculosis he had contracted in the Pacific. Doctors removed his left lung and 5 ribs. For the rest of his life, he survived on one lung, breathing with difficulty, his body a testament to what he had sacrificed. He married Dorothy, the nurse who had believed in him when the army had tried to destroy him, and they built a quiet life together far from the battlefields that had nearly killed him. He rarely spoke about the war unless asked. When people called him a hero, he deflected the praise. He had only done what was right. He had only done what his faith demanded. God had given him the strength to save those men. He had simply been the instrument. But the men he saved never forgot. For decades after the war, Doss received letters from soldiers whose lives he had pulled from that clifftop, men who had gone on to marry, raise families, build careers, all because a skinny medic from Virginia had refused to leave them behind. Some wrote that they thought of him every time they held their children, knowing that without Doss, those children would never have been born. Others described how they had returned from the war broken by what they had seen, but that remembering Doss's faith had given them something to hold on to when everything else felt meaningless. Captain Jack Glover, the man who had tried to have Doss discharged, remained in contact with him for the rest of his life. In interviews years later, Glover said, "He was one of the bravest persons alive, and then to have him end up saving my life was the irony of the whole thing." In 1962, on the 100th anniversary of the Medal of Honor, the other recipients selected Desmond Doss to represent them at a White House ceremony. President John F. Kennedy shook his hand and thanked him for his service. Doss stood among men who had led charges, destroyed enemy positions, captured objectives through violence and courage. He was the only one who had earned the medal without ever firing a shot. In his later years, Doss would teach groups of children the bowline knot he had used to lower 75 men down Hacksaw Ridge. He explained that it was the same knot, that God had taught it to him in a moment when he needed it most. Some of the children believed him. Others thought it was just a story. But Doss never wavered. Everything he had accomplished on Okinawa had been through faith. God had answered his prayer over and over, 75 times. "Lord, please help me get one more." Desmond Doss died on March 23, 2006, at the age of 87, after being hospitalized with difficulty breathing. His single remaining lung had finally failed. He was buried at the Chattanooga National Cemetery in Tennessee. At his funeral, veterans from Company B, now old men themselves, stood and saluted as his casket was lowered into the ground. Some of them were men he had saved on Hacksaw Ridge, men who had lived full lives because of what he had done on a single Saturday in May 1945. They had come to say goodbye to the medic who had refused to carry a weapon, who had been beaten and mocked and nearly court-martialed for his beliefs, and who had proven that the greatest courage is not found in taking lives, but in saving them. This story is not really about one soldier. It is about the power of conviction, about what becomes possible when a person refuses to compromise their principles, even when everyone around them demands it. The army had tried to break Desmond Doss. His fellow soldiers had tried to drive him out. His commanding officers had tried to discharge him as mentally unfit. Every institution and authority he encountered told him that his faith was incompatible with military service, that a soldier without a weapon was useless, that his convictions would get men killed. They were all wrong. Doss proved that courage does not require violence, that saving lives is harder and braver than taking them, that faith can sustain a man through conditions that would break anyone else. The men who once called him a coward learned on Hacksaw Ridge that he possessed more courage than any of them. He had faced death unarmed, over and over, and had never flinched. The legacy of Desmond Doss extends beyond the 75 men he saved. He became the first conscientious objector to receive the Medal of Honor, opening a path for others who would serve their country without carrying weapons. After Doss, 2 more conscientious objectors would receive the Medal of Honor: Thomas W. Bennett and Joseph G. LaPointe Jr., both medics who died saving lives in Vietnam. Doss had shown that it was possible to be both a pacifist and a hero, that refusing to kill did not mean refusing to serve, that conviction and courage were not opposites, but partners. His example inspired generations of medics, chaplains, and others who served in non-combatant roles, proving that the uniform does not require carrying a gun to be worthy of honor. When Desmond Doss knelt in the mud on May 5, 1945, preparing to climb back up Hacksaw Ridge after his prayers, he had no way of knowing that he was about to accomplish something that would seem impossible even to those who witnessed it. He did not know that within hours he would be alone on a clifftop with enemy soldiers hunting him, that he would spend 12 hours dragging wounded men to safety one at a time, that he would use a knot he had never seen before to lower 75 men down a 400-foot cliff. He only knew that wounded men needed help, and that his faith would not permit him to abandon them. So he climbed those cargo nets one more time, carrying his medical bag and his Bible, trusting that God would give him the strength to do whatever needed to be done, and God did. Over and over, 75 times, the prayer was answered, "Lord, please help me get one more." The conscientious objector who was beaten in the barracks became the hero his unit refused to fight without. The man the army tried to discharge became the first non-combatant to receive the Medal of Honor. The soldier, without a weapon, proved to be the bravest man on the battlefield. Desmond Doss showed the world that the greatest victories are not always won through violence, that the truest courage is found in refusing to compromise your convictions no matter the cost, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon is the one you choose not to carry. On Hacksaw Ridge, in the midst of the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War, one unarmed soldier saved 75 lives and proved that faith, courage, and conviction are forces more powerful than any weapon ever made. If you want to hear more true stories from World War II that reveal the human cost and extraordinary courage behind the headlines, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. I spend months researching declassified documents, combat records, and first-hand testimonies to bring you these forgotten stories of valor and sacrifice. Click the notification bell so you don't miss when I post the next video exploring another untold chapter of history.